All right, welcome everybody to I think it's the 16th or 17th Peace Roundtable with the American University in Moscow. And this is a very solemn um, roundtable. We have, obviously, I think everybody here knows that Dr. Edward Lozansky, who sparked this project, passed away earlier last week in Moscow. He lived an incredible life and inspired so many minds. And I'm sure that he'd be happy to know that his torch is not being dropped, but is being picked up. The historic moment as well, just having been, I mean, Peter, myself, many others, Marty, interacted with him on Elba Day. And he was just, I mean, the pride, the joy, the excitement, the inspiration that he had managing this Elba Day event on April 25th was great. It was good for the soul, a real testament to the purpose of his life, to, as a man of peace, devoted to restoring the better traditions of East and West, Russia, USA, and the world at large. So he got to see a great celebration of that. And now we just passed the May 7th Victory Day. And of course, the parade went down without any dangerous terrorist actions or disruptive influences that were threatened by certain forces or certain off-kilter figures in Ukraine. So that's good. But there's still a lot of mines in the minefield. And so today we've got an array of guests, people who have worked with Ed for many, many years, who will share their thoughts as well as their broader considerations about the world today as we see it, still teetering as we are on the verge of a precipice. I don't have a direct list in order, so I do see a bunch of people here who will be speaking and sharing thoughts briefly. They will be smaller than usual offerings due to the fact that there's just a larger than usual number of people who Ed knew a lot of people in his life, and so this will serve as a double whammy: geopolitical um, assessment of the world as well as an assessment and appreciation of Ed's life. I've got a couple of recordings too from friends of Ed, Jim Jatras being one, Ray McGovern being the other. But first, before anybody else, how about Peter? Would you like to kick off
Yeah,
the proceedings today?
sure. Happy to. Um, I've got to leave a little early. Got an Iran TV sh interview
Good.
and a Russia one, but um, Ed was a force of nature. Uh, he was a citizen diplomat of the highest order. He wanted nothing more than to build bonds of friendship and peace between the two nations he loved the most, Russia and the United States. I spent close to a half a year in Russia and a half year back here in the United States. I think he had dual citizenship, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Uh, he was indefatigable in his efforts. He never lost hope, no matter how bleak things appeared to be. We've worked closely together over the past decade, despite the fact that our politics couldn't have been more different. Ed was a conservative Republican. I've always been on the left, a democratic socialist, anti-war and anti-nuclear activist. We did overlap on some things. Ed was a renowned fusion physicist, and in a former lifetime, I was the chair of the Fusion Energy Foundation in the Rocky Mountain region. We've done scores of events together, almost all of which Ed helped organize, trying to diffuse the tensions between the U.S. and Russia and trying to combat U.S. Russophobia. No one did more for peace than Ed. We first met 9 years ago. I just this morning found the email he sent me. It was comforting in the fact that in some ways our relationship came full circle. The first email I got was titled Greetings. This was in 2016. He says, Dear Dr. Kuznik, I wonder if you will be interested to meet the Dean of the Department of Global Studies at Moscow State University, Professor Yaelian, who is coming to Washington in search of potential cooperation partners for their international programs. And he gave me a couple dates. And he said, if yes, please indicate the most appropriate time, and I'll bring him to your office. Thank you for considering his request, Edward. Well, he and Dean Alien came over, and we had a great talk. Then they invited me back to Ed and Tatiana's for lunch that day. Uh, and that was beginning of a friendship with Ed that has lasted very intensely over the past decade, as well as with Dean Ilyin. I was in Moscow a couple weeks ago to chair the documentary jury at the Moscow International Film Festival. Ed arrived a couple of days after me. He and Tatiana had just spent a couple of days in the United Arab Emirates to relax and to ease the difficulty of the traveling. And he was eager to join me at the film festival. So I was able to get him and Tatiana VIP passes to all the films, all the events, all the parties, the red carpet affairs that were going on. Uh, and I should have maybe realized the fact that they were too exhausted to show up for any of the events that they were so looking forward to, in some ways reflected what I guess that Ed was already exhausted. And I didn't quite put that together at the time. Uh, then that Thursday, the Thursday before Ed passed, I was invited to speak at Moscow State University. So Ed helped arrange it. He came with me. Dean Ilyin made the uh, introduced us, and then I gave the talk. Ed sat up there in the front with me, and I was talking about the world situation and U.S. and Russian relations and the broader crises the world is facing. And in there, I started, and Ed was agreeing with everything until I got to the part where I was talking about Donald Trump. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ed shaking his head very vigorously, disagreeing with me about Donald Trump. But the fact that we disagreed about these things so intensely never got in the way of our friendship, never got in the way of our collaboration, never got in the way of Ed's appreciation of what I did. In fact, he liked it because it showed that people on the right and people on the left could actually work together on these things, even if we disagreed about other things. Because when it came, Ed understood that the most important thing was peace. And without that, nothing else was meaningful. And so Ed and I collaborated despite all of our disagreements. He came up afterwards and said how much he loved my talk and didn't even mention the disagreements that we had. Well, that evening, I was told that I was supposed to give a speech at the film festival. And I asked, well, what am I supposed to talk about? They said, talk about the documentary that won. We chose a Chinese documentary. And Ed was supposed to be there, but he never made it there. And so I was there on Russian national television. It's like the Academy Awards, the way they do it there on the with the big presentations. And I started, and I impromptu said I had this prepared talk about the documentary that won, but I first said how important it was, how special it was for me to be at the film festival, to be invited, given the great tensions between our two countries. And I said I was only one of two Americans who was at the film festival this year. The other was an actor named John Robinson, who's a really good guy, now lives in Paris. He got tired of Hollywood. Uh, and then I said that I'd spoken to Moscow State University that day. And afterwards, I was told by the dean that I was the first American to have spoken there in more than 3 years, which didn't make me happy. It made me sad, and I said that to the audience there, and I said it reminded me of President Kennedy's commencement address at American University when he said it's made him sad to think about how deep was the gulf between our two nations. And I said we have to heal that gulf. And we have to do so in order to begin building those bonds of friendship again. We need to end, and I call it the invasion of Ukraine. Uh, and I got tremendous applause from the audience. It was very, very gratifying. And that was on national TV. Then the next day, I joined Ed and Tatiana at the park across the street from their apartment. They've got the plaques to the American and the Russian troops meeting at the Elbe River and Lincoln. And, and again, Ed organized it. There were dozens and dozens of people there. And it was a cold, rainy morning and then a cold, windy afternoon. And so I came and Ed introduced me and I gave my talk. And Ed stayed there throughout the morning, throughout the afternoon, into the evening. And I was told he got sick that day. And, and then passed a couple days later. Uh, and it was so typical of Ed that despite the terrible weather, despite the fact that he was probably already exhausted, he was so passionate in his desire to bring peace and reconciliation and friendship between our countries that he stayed out there. I had to leave, but he remained all day, and it was too much for him. Uh, but at Moscow State the day before, I was supposed to go on Peter Lavelle's crosstalk show on RT with Hall Gardner. And I told Ed that I was going to have to leave Moscow State early. And he said, Peter, you can't do that. We're having lunch with Dean Ilyin and lead, the other leaders of Moscow State, and it's very important to them. And so you have to stay. He got on the phone with Peter Lavelle, and he canceled my hearing on the show because he wanted me to stay with him and Dean Ilyin at Moscow State, because he sees that, because Ed always understood the importance of universities. And he wanted to make bridges between American University and Moscow State and other universities and American University in Moscow. And so we postponed my appearance on that show till the next week. But in thinking about this morning, it brought a kind of closure to me because I've been feeling terrible, very, very sad and depressed, and sort of lost in a way because of what Ed represented in my life. And I wasn't at all prepared. He was so full of life, it never entered my mind to even begin to worry about his health or his energy. And but the fact that we began our friendship around Dean Ilyin and we ended it around Dean Ilyin brought a certain kind of closure because as all of us know, Ed was a unique figure. Ed was more than anybody else the person who tried to resolve the tensions, bring peace, bring friendship, bring understanding, bring enlightenment, and make sure that our countries not only didn't go to war, but that we work together to make a better world. And so, Ed to me represents that as much as, if not more than anybody else. So it's sad, but I loved him and miss him and honor him and respect him and want to try to do everything I can to carry on what his life was dedicated to and what our friendship was revolved around. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. That was beautiful. I'm gonna shift gears to Jim Jatras, who couldn't be with us today live, but he did record a 3-minute memorial. So I'm just gonna play that right now. Hopefully the sound shares. So Jim Jatras had been working with Ed for many, many years. And yeah, he really, really wanted to be here today, but I'm just going to play this right now.
I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about my friend Ed Lozansky, somebody I've known since the early 1980s. This is back in the day when everybody thought the Cold War with the Soviet Union and communism would go on forever. And, Ed and I were two of those unusual people in those days who were against the Soviet government and against communism, but were not in any sense anti-Russia. I mean, in fact, when we look back on those days, so many of the people who pretended to be anti-communist or anti-Soviet were really just anti-Russia, and communism really had nothing much to do with it. And Ed was always the genuine article. I mean, there was nothing contrived about him. You know, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile. He was always a straightforward person, and he was remarkable how he combined two remarkable qualities. One was obviously courage, and the other one was optimism. His courage, you know, this is a guy who had no hesitation, first as in a dissident movement inside the Soviet Union, and later on in the West, trying to get his wife Tatiana out of the Soviet Union, to stand up to what he thought was oppressive behavior by the Soviet government, and he was not afraid of anything. But then when the shoe was on the other foot here in the United States, when things turned against his expectations and hopes, the governments of the West, particularly the American government, became very, very hostile to Russia. Well, he wasn't afraid of them either, and he was you know, had the same courage, the same pluck, the same stand up for what is right attitude that he had displayed earlier on. And the other one, of course, was his optimism. Ed always believed that the United States and Russia could be friends, the spirit of the Elbe. And, you know, he and I collaborated on many, many writings over the years, trying to float the idea that the United States and Russia could always be friends. And frankly, from my point of view, you know, that hope has faded. I hope we can have at least correct relations, not hostile relations. I'm not sure we could ever truly be friends. I hope I'm wrong about that. But Ed always believed he could do that. And it's remarkable, especially with his World Russian Forum that he held for so many years at the U.S. Senate, the kind of people he would bring into that gathering that would share that vision, or at least pretend to, in some cases, when I think of somebody like John McCain there, for crying out loud. But nonetheless, he was able to make that case to people that they needed to get on that bandwagon while that lasted, that brief shining moment when it looked like something like that could actually happen. But he never lost hope, and his loss is just a tremendous one for all people of goodwill in the world, in Russia and America and everywhere else. He's very tragic. He's going to be missed. He is irreplaceable. And it's just a very sad day for all of us. But, you know, I hope all of us can retain not only his memory, but his spirit of fight, and even of that degree of optimism. Because, you know, even though things may seem very dark at sometimes, there's always hope, and unexpected things happen. And let's just all remember him fondly and try to be inspired by his example.
All right.
First of all, I'm struck, obviously, not just agreeing with everything Peter and Jim just said, but they actually, they spoke for me, and I'm sure they spoke for many other people too. But while my remarks are slightly different, not contradictory in any ways, I'm struck by the depth in my soul to which Peter and Jim nailed the inner essence and greatness of Ed. And I think all of us here, most of us here, certainly those of us who knew him over many years, will have felt that too. The optimism was so central to him. The courage was so central to him. In Imperial Washington, a city where everybody wears masks and everybody blows with the prevailing wind, he never, and I see Hall's, the look of recognition on your face, Hall, clearly you saw this with him too. From opposing communism so fearlessly to opposing our own manic, mad, deep state now so fearlessly, it was all one with him. He was always, that was exactly always what he was. And Peter too, when he talked about feeling bereft, depressed, afloat, what shall I do now? That was exactly the way it struck me as well. I'd known Ed for nearly 40 years. and not quite as long as Jim, I think, but I think we first met. He was already an eminent columnist at the Washington Times, and I'd just been brought in to cover the Soviet Union and the crises that were going on there. And I was working for another genius who also deeply appreciated Ed, another extraordinary man, the late Count Arno de Borgraaf, who was editor-in-chief of the Washington Times then, and who brought in a most extraordinary and eclectic group of talented people from his own, already at that point, 40 years in eminent journalism. And Arno had another 30 years to go. So I'm sitting at my desk, and I've been doing several articles already, small ones in the paper. And this great, big, impressive, towering gentleman with a Russian accent. And you remember Ed's style, for a man of such accomplishment, such achievement, such an extraordinary life. He was extraordinarily humble, even shy initially. I mean, he was unbelievably courageous, but his style was very tentative when he met you. He made everybody feel they were doing him a favor by giving him courtesy. And in Washington, one thing that fascinated me over the years from the very beginning was the number of people who hated Ed, who warned me against him. And what was all their arguments? That he was corrupt, that he was probably working for the Soviets, or we didn't know where his money was coming. Exactly. You're ahead of me, Matt, because this is classic Freudian projection. It was wonderful hypocrisy. We call it now gaslighting, a term that I find my kids use all the time, especially towards me. And it was the pot calling the kettle black, because Ed, of course, was none of those things. But everyone who hated him and who backstabbed him, or who would warn you for your own good, don't be seen publicly with that guy, don't support that guy. They were the cowards. They were the hypocrites. They were the people who all worked for the Daily Telegraph, worked for the Heritage Foundation in Washington, got their money from Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop Grumman. You're ahead of me, Erwin. Let us talk about this afterwards. Clearly, you know a bit more about this than me, but same wavelength. The pot was always calling the kettle black, even in the 1980s. And I never took them seriously or listened to them, but I should have taken them seriously because they were significant. Not in, they couldn't stop Ed, but I was looking at a very important phenomenon and I didn't recognize it. And that was the hatred and jealousy of evil for virtue, because these forces really live in the world. These forces really live in the world. And this was fascinating to me. Now, like Peter, I was so depressed when Ed died, and a thought came to me immediately. That really struck me. Love the music of George Gershwin. George Gershwin died very young. The day after he died, John Dos Passos wrote in his diary, a very great and very underestimated American writer, who, interestingly enough, one of his great admirers, he's very much out of fashion today, but another very unfashionable writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of all people, deeply revered Dos Passos and modeled a lot of the techniques he used in the Red Wheel trilogy on what Dos Passos had done 50 years before in the 1930s. And Dos Passos wrote, on hearing of the death of George Gershwin, I read in today's newspaper that George Gershwin has just died at the age of 37. But I don't have to believe it if I don't want to. And I think that's the essence of Ed too, that he was so, when I learned from Matt that Ed had died, obviously it was factual, but I could not believe it. Like Peter, like Jim, I could not process it because he was always so full of life. I last saw him in person, and again, we're back to the UAE again, Peter. A familiar trope again, which perhaps other people will bring up, because he and I were both delegates at the Eurasian Economic Forum in December at Ras Al Khaimah in the United Arab Emirates, and it's a long trip out there. And although Emirati Airlines always do you proud, I was pretty much of a wreck when I got there. And I was operating, as they say in Star Trek, on impulse power only when I was there. And Ed was 10 years older than I am. And Ed was full of life and vitality when we were there. I mean, he wasn't slowing down at all. And I remember thinking and even joking with him, you know, I'll be gone long before you are. Of course, this is a very Irish approach anyway. And the Irish are all creaking gates who last the longest. And we last the longest because we are hypochondriacs, all of us, but very melodramatic. But it's a far superior way to be. Ed, that way, was much more typically Russian. My wife, similarly, they're courageous, they're solid, they go on forever, they'll serve everybody else, but they won't look after themselves. They won't look after themselves. Whereas with the Irish, everything revolves around our aches and pains. And that was true even then. But Ed was more like 44 than 84. I was also privileged to know for many years, and I covered him whenever he came to Washington, the late mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, a great figure like Ed to bring peace and reconciliation between peoples who had been set at odds with each other for generations. And Kollek was that kind of man too. And he shared a great deal with Ed, the limitless energy. On one occasion, he comes to town at 93 and Kollek is depressed. Why is he depressed? Because he'd only worked a 16-hour day and then he felt tired. He's 93 years old and he's worried he might be slowing down a bit and it's depressing him. He's not used to this, right? Now that's Ed. That's Ed all over. That's Ed to a T. But also another key point that Peter emphasized, and Jim did too, but you nailed it, Peter, is there were so many different aspects to Ed and his genius. And he was a polymath. And like so many polymaths, above all, he was an educator. He founded Moscow State University. He was a significant figure at American University. You were his soulmate, Peter. So many of he had so many, but his soulmates especially were great educators from around the world. He introduced me to a colleague of mine at Pluralia, which is based in Verona, Italy. I had never met before, Professor Francesco Sidoti. And of course, it turned out they were lifelong friends, going back at least 40 years together, if not more. And that's, of course, the kind of man he was. You knew him for a day, you knew him for 40 years. It was all the same. You were in an enchanted network, and a network of the good guys and the good gals. And a network, Isaac Babel talks about this in his short story Gadal, where he has a victim of the upheavals of the Russian Revolution saying, I pray for a socialist international, a new international, not an international of Marxists or of socialists or of ideologists, but of kind and good-hearted people who will come together to make good in the world. And that was our friend. Thank you.
Beautiful, Marty. That was great. I could feel Ed smiling.
I hope so.
Hall, Professor Hall Gardner, are you still there?
Yes. Well, boy, after that, Marty's eulogy was amazing. So was his article about Ed.
Thank you.
I have to pick up something on what Peter said, and that was Ed's ability to both listen to the left and the right. I myself, my first experience with Ed, he invited me to Moscow to debate a Washington Times reporter named Tony Blankley, who was the most far right-wing guy, anti-immigrant, and it was right after the September 11th, and the French were rioting in the streets, and they were always mixing up immigration and terrorism. And I didn't know what I was being there, but I guess Ed had invited me to provide an alternative perspective to this right-wing nationalism. And he said the same thing recently when he published one of my articles. He says he'd been accused of publishing too many pro-Trump articles. He had to publish someone who was at least more or less on the Democratic side, though I'm critical of both parties. But what I want to say today is something slightly different. One of my themes of my second novel, Year of the Horseshoe Bat in Exile, is the irony of how many brilliant atomic scientists in the USA, Soviet Union, UK, France, China, and Israel all became dissidents. Fang Lizi in China had worked on China's secret A-bomb program until he was expelled from the Chinese Communist Party for supporting the 1989 student demands and anti-corruption democratic movement that was crushed Tiananmen. Fang Lizi was not the only Chinese dissident, however, only dissident atomic scientist who became a dissident. Of course, we can mention Robert Oppenheimer in the United States, Frederick Joliot-Curie in France, Mordecai Vanunu in Israel, Andrei Sakharov, who Ed knew in the Soviet Union. Ed was among those great dissidents. As Marty pointed out in his eulogy, he was one of the great dissidents. He had been a Soviet nuclear physicist and lost all of his research and teaching positions because of his outspoken criticism of both Soviet and Soviet foreign and domestic policy. And then he was forced, of course, to leave to the United States. Now, what is great, particularly great about Ed, I think, was his ability to maintain a dialogue between the U.S. and Soviet Union and then the U.S. and Russia now. This is what made Ed unique and so rare. And of course, as was pointed out by Marty, he was criticized by all sides because he was someone who was attempting to mediate, someone who's trying to bring these clashing points of view, left and right, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, together into a common viewpoint and a common policy. I think for that reason, we need to continue what Ed has started. And I just find it of the highest irony that he passed away right at the verge of the possibility of a U.S.-Russian reconciliation, U.S.-European-Russian reconciliation. Let us hope we can continue in that path and move forward with Ed's vision. Thank you.
Amen. Robert's a writer and a friend of Ed, Zepos.
Yes, very good. Usually it takes people quite a few years to do that. Good for you.
I had to psych myself up a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyway, I wanted to say amen to so many of the speakers who spoke before. Obviously, Hall just talked about we need to finish what he started. And of course, Martin talked about the enchanted network. Well, he was sort of the glue of that enchanted network of all the people that are here on the left, some are on the right. But we all basically are disgusted with the people in charge because they brought the world much closer to nuclear war than we ever thought possible. And I hope that we can continue. And I know if Ed were here, he would talk about how we could maybe even meet individually and to try to see where we can work together on various projects. I hope that's possible. After he died, I actually bought back the book for Tatiana. And since Jim Jatras talked about his optimism and his courage, I thought I'd read just very briefly and try not to go too far over, but what he wrote at the time that talked about his optimism. So obviously in the 1958, even though he did very well on his exams, he was rejected, partly because he suffered a great deal of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. And he said, so when he was rejected and he really hurt, he said, and I quote, "For weeks I spoke to no one. I would get up early in the morning, leave the house, wander the streets of Kiev, seeking out distant roads and nooks where I was sure I would run into no one I knew. I even refused to speak to my family. Several times I descended the sandy banks of the Dnieper, walked endlessly through the woods and surrounded the city. It was autumn, and the foliage of the chestnut and maple trees was bursting with beauty, but it had no effect on me. I was alone, miserable, and depressed. But those whom life wounds, she also restores. Since that time, I have always hated pessimists, those who blame all their problems on others or on the world they live in. Lying, cowardice, spite, and stupidity are anathema to me. When I am down, I am at my best. I attribute that quality in large measure to the long hours I spent during the autumn of 1958 in the Kiev woods, alone with my shame and anger before I finally came to my senses. I touched bottom. The whole world was allied against me. My only recourse was to recognize the facts and face up to them. It was my only chance for survival. That was him in a nutshell. In 1958, he could have said that just a few days ago when I last spoke to him. I first met him when I was a kid because my parents were very close friends with the younger sister, and obviously his parents also lived in Rochester, New York, which is where I was born. My parents were also from the Soviet Union and came almost around the same time Ed did. It wasn't until 2009 I got involved with him because I'd obviously read For Tatiana and I was inspired, and I wanted to be involved in the peace movement to prevent these two countries from engaging in nuclear war. And obviously in 2009 there was the reset, and it was an inspirational time, if only briefly. And then things got worse. And so when I spoke to Ed's sister, I think, the only thing she wanted to talk about was how in shock she was, and just he was a force of nature. When he was born in Kiev, he was touched by war almost right away, and obviously his grandmother, his older sister, and his mother went to the Urals during the war, and his father fought in the war, and then of course they all survived, and then they had to live in this kommunalka, which was this for 6 people, because then his younger sister was born. And it was just, they had to share this bathroom with 5 families in Kiev, and obviously a kitchen. And for him, he could have easily recoiled and believed in pessimism, but then he said, no, I want to become a scientist. And yes, he got rejected the first time and the second time. And then the third time he actually got into the university after years of trying to find work but never giving up. And then obviously, we all know the story about how he met Tatiana and how he fought for her. But I think that what I hope that people realize is that the same elite that he was a part of in the 1970s, when his father-in-law basically granted him access to this elite, and now in the 90s, when he was, by his own account, the golden boy. In both of these cases, he looked at this elite as corrupt, as materialistic, and he just couldn't be a part of these people. He just, for me, it was also just this final straw of, you just can't, you don't need a degree in nuclear physics to understand this basic point, that nuclear weapons are not a joke. They're not toys for rich idiots to play with. And yet that's what we're dealing with. And in conclusion, I want to just say that obviously, since Ed was Jewish, I want to point out that this is a very reflective time in the Jewish calendar. It's between Passover and Shavuot, when obviously the Torah was given, and it's a time when we are supposed to reflect between the time of the Passover, when people get physical freedom, to spiritual renewal. Like Rabbi Akiva's disciples who passed away in this time, our goal is hopefully to stick together, to whether we're left or right, doesn't matter. As one of the speakers said in the chat, it's up versus down. And we need to continue to work together wherever possible, because quite frankly, the people in charge have taken us to a brink that we can never trust them again. And unlike Jim Jatras, I'm more optimistic. It's just that these people who are in charge need to be replaced, because I think there are very good people in both countries that want to live. And I know that Ed would be very happy to see all of us here. And he would also say, get to work, because that's what we've got to do. So good luck. I look forward to working with all of you. And remember one thing, as Ed would say, we are proud of you. And we're proud of everything that you guys are doing to stand up to the people who refuse and want to have all the privileges in life, and just say, we're not going to let these people prematurely end our lives, or whether it's our children's lives. We're going to work together, because that's what we have to do. So good luck. I look forward to talking to all of you.
Thank you, Robert. That is exactly what Ed would say. And maybe not those exact words, but that's exactly the intention and the spirit. Absolutely. And I was a little bit agonized at first when I heard that Ed had passed, and I was like, well, I guess that's it for the roundtable, the Peace Roundtable process. And that took all of 2 hours for me to shake myself out of that. And I realized, no, not at all. No, Ed would be pissed if he heard that I stopped doing that just because he wasn't physically here. His spirit obviously is much more than that. And so yeah, we're gonna keep that fight going. And the whole idea that Ed had committed to being himself a citizen who just rose beyond the limits of his circumstances. He had so many boundaries put on him throughout his life, but he always found a way to shift gears mentally, as you pointed out through that beautiful passage, to tap into a spirit of optimism that allowed him to tap into the creative powers that were needed to just completely change the circumstances, break through those boundary conditions, and create new potentials, both for himself and for Tatiana and his family, but then for humanity more largely. And he saw that everybody could do that if they just were able to get over their cynicism. So absolutely, and every time, his youthfulness was really unbounded, and he would just call me every couple of days with a new cartoon idea, a new idea for a video, a new film, a new script that he wanted to create. Like there was always something bubbling and bustling inside of him. And he would just throw darts, and sometimes they'd hit the mark, sometimes they wouldn't, but he would just have an endless supply of darts that he would just shoot. And it was inspiring. And like you said, I heard everybody sort of alluding to this in different ways. It made us feel, even me, he could be my father, maybe my grandfather if he started really young, but it made me feel like an old man. I'm just seeing this guy's generative powers. So yeah, let's listen to Ray McGovern, who also collaborated with Ed for a very long time. So we'll just do a little screen share here. Share sound.
Good morning. During the last 2 weeks, I had the privilege of being in Moscow and other parts of Russia with Oliver Stone. We get back this morning, and I'm a little groggy, so I'm going to speak from a couple of notes here. A few days ago, we had dinner with Dmitry Peskov, spokesperson for President Putin. And we engaged in some conversation, and Peskov all of a sudden asked me, "Were you not trained to hate Russia?" I had to explain to him that I went to Fordham University, where we had professors there who taught us Russian literature, Russian history, Russian music. It was called area studies at the time. And once you knew these things, it was impossible to hate Russia. As a matter of fact, it was impossible not to love the Russian history, language, and people. And so it was with Ed Lozansky, our good friend. It was not only hard, it was impossible not to love Ed. I want to just mention to you that Ed took me along to Moscow 10 years ago for the 70th anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe. It was a wonderful affair. Tatiana, of course, was there. Maybe some of you were also there, but it was very moving. And Ed asked me to speak, and I did. And after it, and this is the point I want to make, after it, a very tall, he was 90 years old at the time, Soviet general, Alexander Adgamov, comes up to me, and I was finished speaking, and he looks at me and he says, Studebaker. Studebaker! And then he grabs me in a great big Russian bear hug and says, Studebaker! Now to this audience, I don't have to explain how the Studebaker car and truck manufacturing complex was turned completely over to making trucks and jeeps and other weapons holders and troop holders for the war, and how they went through Iran and came into southern Russia and were very helpful to people like Lieutenant at that time, Adgamov, and in helping them win the Battle of Kursk and so forth. So I recited a poem there, and that was the reason why Adgamov came up to me. we did a lot of memorizing at Fordham, and this one poem stuck in my head. I used it again just 10 days ago, speaking to the Znania Youth Forum. Let me, in honor of Ed, say it one more time, because it's the other side of the meeting on the Elbe. The meeting on the Elbe was, you've seen all the representations of it, people who survived, people who didn't die, people who weren't terribly wounded. And so I thought we needed to remind this group of young people. It was a youth forum run by Znania, of the horrors of war. And so I'm going to repeat that now in honor of Ed, since he liked it so much, and since I get to use it again just this past, 10 days ago or so. Внимая ужасом войны. That's the title. Внимая ужасом войны при каждой новой жертве боя, мне жаль не друга, не жены, мне жаль не самого героя. Увы, утешишь жена и друга, лучший друг забудет, а где-то есть душа одна. Она до гроба помнить будет. Среди лицемерных наших дел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел. Святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой Неве, как не понять плакучей иве своих поникнувших ветвей. It's Mother's Day, it just occurs to me. Maybe that's a special reason to talk about the uniquely sincere tears of mothers who lose sons and daughters on the field of battle, on the bloody battlefield, as poet Ruskoy Skorby Nekrasov put it. So let me just close now and talk about love. It's hard not to love Russia, its history, its literature, and its people, and most of all, its language. For me, most of all, its language. I used to teach it. But when you talk about love and you're thinking about Ed Lozansky, well, there's the quintessential lover. Okay. Thank you, Tatiana, for making with Ed the most wonderful love story ever. And what is unique about it, it is real. It continues to be real. And so let me just say to Tatiana and the rest of you, прощай и друга не забудь. We will not forget Ed, and sincere condolences to you, Tatiana, and the rest of your family. Thanks very much, Ray McGovern, signing off. To get a good sleep. Bye now.
Yeah. We are coming up to the end of our list. I wanted to show quickly, Ed had requested that Cynthia and I help him put together his memoirs a couple of years back, 2020, little after we first met him. And I want people to, if they don't know about this, I'll just do a little screen share. I'm going to show the cover right now of building U.S.-Russia bridges. It's short. He was able to get a very, very robust life that could have been expanded probably into many thousands of pages, down to 60. So it's really a large essay, and it's in the form of a book that's available on Amazon or as a PDF that people can download in the description box under this video once it's up online on YouTube and Rumble and elsewhere. It's an incredible story featuring the harrowing tale of his efforts to keep his family together, I mean, everything that people have alluded to, his friends have alluded to in the course of today's proceedings, are gone through in Ed's own words, just to get across how he became one of several key figures who worked as citizen through back channel diplomacy between the U.S. and the Soviets. How a lot of great plans were sabotaged, and how he was able to rebuild, regroup, and always create a new flank that was unexpected. So this is just a really, really special book that really warmed my heart, and I was really, really moved that he ended his manuscript with the very, very final call to action in his concluding remarks, which I guess I'll just read just quickly. That I was honored that he included a word to myself as well, that I got to play a role in his book and his life. And certainly he became very much a father figure to me, and schooled me in the rules, the art of diplomacy, which, let's say, are lessons I needed to learn over time. I always had a little bit of a brash quality of attacking first before developing a sense of whether or not that was a fight worth having, or whether bridges could be built in potential allies. So that was I was reminded when he was helping me out of the remark by Friedrich Schiller, the great poet of freedom, who had said, one should always temper the poet's zeal with worldliness, speaking to the young, brash poets out there who want to just change the world, but sometimes lack the sensitivity to actually navigate with sagesse throughout the nuances of human dynamics. So all that to say, he definitely was able to walk in all corridors and bring about the best in people. And in his concluding remarks here, I'll just read it with you guys. He says, "I have now two major problems. My first problem is personal, since some people may read these pages and decide that I am just an ungrateful SOB whom America helped at a time of need, but now dares to criticize our foreign policy. These people may accuse me of biting the feeding hand. My answer to them is that I love America and am deeply grateful to this country for my family and my freedom. And it is this love that causes me to worry so much about the well-being and security of the United States. The controversy only arises due to the fact that my vision of how America's well-being and security are best achieved differs substantially from that of the current U.S. foreign policy establishment. Although some may accuse me of holding a radical viewpoint here, I am of the firm belief that the interests of all nations are best ensured through cooperation and long-term projects designed to improve the lives of the next generation, rather than military confrontation, regime change, and geopolitical games of power. My colleague Matthew Ehret from Montreal has outlined a long list of points of common benefits in space, asteroid defense, Arctic, Far East, educational, cultural exchange, climate change, fission, fusion energy research, counterterrorism, COVID response coordination. I didn't really do much of that, and many other areas. The big question is, how can we revive a genuine U.S.-Russia dialogue when the current political atmosphere tends to ensure anyone promoting such dialogue is labeled Putin's stooge, Russia's bootlicker, or useful idiot at best? It certainly looks like another hopeless cause. But everyone has a choice. Do nothing and wait for the inevitable, or speak while there is still time to avoid, in the words of Senator Sam Nunn, sleepwalking into nuclear catastrophe. My choice is the latter. What is yours? And I think that very poignant call to action is more pressing now than it was 5 years ago when he wrote those words. I think today we have reached the top of the hour. I don't know. I got everybody who had requested a bit of time to speak has spoken. I'll open it up if there's anybody additional who would like to chime in with a thought or a word very briefly before we listen to a musical offering by Ed. Richard has just requested a bit of space. So Richard, yeah, sure, shoot it.
Well, I just wanted to say we're at this transitional moment where a whole new world order is being created under BRICS, which has so many of the qualities that we talk about here in an RTF about what we would want in the society. And then over here we have the last thrashings of the imperial virus, let's say started in Venice, and it's finally found its final home, and it's rapidly going down. And Russia and China, their arms are open at any time. So I think looking at this like from, say, 50 years in the future, it's clear that it has to come out that the West is eventually going to have to say, gee, do we want to survive or not, and invite Chinese investment and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, that's how I see it. Thank you.
Agreed. Yes, absolutely. All right, so let's do this. Let's round it out with a little bit of music. Ed had composed something a few years ago in honor of a meeting on the ELBA conference that he had organized, and he had two renditions, one with a synthetic digital software that put his composition to music digitally, which will be the first half of the multimedia experience we're about to have. The second, he actually hired a very talented orchestral group to perform it live, my personal favorite, which will be the second half. I think you guys will enjoy this if you haven't seen it already. So let me just do a little share here. This is a Waltz for Peace. I think that was a fitting way to close off today's proceedings. And for anybody who wants to share, oh, it's still playing. Hold on a second. I'm hearing music in my ear. I just gotta end that. Okay, sorry. For anybody who wants to share that video or listen to it again, check the description box under this video for that, for the PDF of Ed's memoirs and a variety of other links, including Marty Sieff's wonderful eulogy as well, written in pluralia. And there's going to be a lot of other material I'll throw in there too for those who want to really pick up the torch with all of us. And we will be continuing these sessions in 2 weeks' time. I'm sure the world will certainly give us a lot to talk about. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for all the speakers for sharing. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time, same place, same time. Take care.